Gaming is something that has blown up over the last few years. What used to be a small hobby has turned into something that people can now make a living off of. This type of storytelling creates an immersive experience for us. Sometimes people can get lost in them for hours. Today we're going to look at one specific character that can be found in countless video games: vampires. There are so many different forms that a vampire can take in a video game. Although the books we read and the movies we watched, there was a contrast between our vampires, it wasn't even close to how vastly different vampires can be in the gaming community. In this video, I'm going to take us on a tour of the history of vampires in video games and how they expand the vampiric canon we learned this semester. The first time we see a vampire in video games is in 1979, when Adventure International released a text-based game called The Count. In it, you play a man who gets sent to defeat the Count by local villagers in Transylvania. Your character picks up pieces of paper and moves to different locations to progress into the game. Much like we see in the earliest vampiric stories, the Count refers to vampires being highly dangerous, disgusting monsters. This was so early in the history of gaming that there wasn't actually much of a game. It was very short and lacked quite a bit of lore. Although The Count was the first of its kind, it influenced many other early vampire games. Some other titles that were widely recognized were Dracula, Dracula in London, Ghost House, Vampire Village, and the most common of them all, the Castlevania series. While the earliest vampire games may have lacked in story, authors Roberto Dillon and Anita Lundberg say this isn't because vampires don't belong in the gaming world, but rather early gaming devs weren't sure how to fully portray them yet. In their article, Vampires in Video Games, they talk about how vampires are a wonderful addition to the gaming world because of how rich the gameplay can get. We get to talk, interact, slay vampires, and in some cases even play as our own. One of the first playable vampires we see is in Bureau 13. In this game, there are unlockable characters that each have a set of abilities, one of which is a vampire who can turn into mist. These agents work for a top-secret government branch that deals with supernatural events. Bureau 13 has a fun dynamic of supernatural creatures solving supernatural crimes. This was also the first time we see a vampire try to be on the good side. Although similar to the other early gaming titles, Bureau 13 lacks lore about the vampires. Our vampire agent is simply a man with fangs who wears a red cloak. I think they were going for a Dracula-style vampire, but missed the mark just slightly. Moving on to what might be the most notorious vampire game we see in the early period of vampiric gaming, is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This game not only had a massive impact on the vampiric canon for gaming, but also for women in gaming as well. Although the game is based on the TV show, it was refreshing for young girls to get to play as such a badass woman as she hunts down and kills vampires. The actual monsters in the game are pretty cool to watch too. They look like how a normal NPC or non-playable character would look like. However, when Buffy takes her stake and stabs it into their heart, there is a puff of smoke and they turn into skeletons and then fall to the ground. I love this take on the death of vampires because it makes it much more lighthearted and funny, which is what I think the intent in the game was. The reason the devs think about this so much is that there's a huge debate in the gaming community going on that if violent video games lead to violent people and actions. While Buffy the Vampire Slayer may have had a less violent death than what we studied in class, the games to come after Buffy did not hold back on the violence. If violence was what you wanted, I'd recommend the game Dark. This game was released in 2013 and plays like a stealth game. In it, you play as Eric Bane, a newly transformed vampire who's suffering from amnesia. I think there is a lot of boundaries being pushed by Dark, most importantly that the idea that vampires can suffer from what is considered human illnesses. Dark is also really good at showing how monstrous vampires can be. You find out that Eric isn't fully transformed, and if he doesn't fix it soon, he'll end up mutating into what the game calls a ghoul. The only way to stop this? By drinking the blood of his creator. Modern games are really where we get to see this immersive experience shine. Vampire, which was released just in 2018, is an RPG that focuses on having breathtaking graphics as well as invigorating gameplay. This game follows our main character, Jonathan Reed, more commonly known as the Vampire Doctor. The complex dynamic of morality in vampires is what this game is all about. Jonathan struggles to maintain his moral compass in his new undead life. In the game, you can choose between leveling up your character or not killing innocent people, which preserves his status as a doctor. This moral dilemma we see come up a ton in vampire literature. The difference between this is the connection we build with Jonathan. Getting to play as him in a way makes us feel like we are him. So when we go through the gut-wrenching experiences of his life, it impacts us like it would if it were our own. This is why gaming is such a wonderful tool to tell the stories of the undead. We get to experience it as a vampire would. Although there are many similarities vampires that literature and film share with video games, I think one big difference I see is the lack of seduction. This is extremely funny to me, since that has been what we've been talking about so much this semester. While researching these games and the history of them, the lack of seduction made me question whether these were to be counted as real vampires. After not only watching the gameplay of these, but also playing a few of them myself, I will say with full confidence that the vampires in gaming may lack seduction and be more monstrously portrayed, but that doesn't make them less of a vampire. They usually have some sort of supernatural power, they have that specific aesthetic to them, and most importantly, they have their bloodthirst. They are simply another category of vampires, and who knows, with how much the genre of vampires in gaming has changed over the last 30 years, maybe we will eventually get to see that seduction make it into a game.